Think you know the whole story? Turns out you were probably taught the half-truth. Welcome to Half-Truths. Close your eyes for a moment. I want you to travel back. Not to the 15th century, not yet. I want you to go back to your elementary school classroom. Picture the faded posters on the wall, maybe one of the solar system, another of the food pyramid. Smell the chalk dust and that distinct scent of floor wax and disinfectant. It's October. The construction paper comes out. You're cutting out 3 lopsided shapes. You label them, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. You're learning a story. It's a simple, heroic story, almost a fairy tale. It's about a brave Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus, a man with a revolutionary idea, a man who believed the world was round when everyone else thought it was flat. He sails west to find a new route to the riches of the East, battling storms, a frightened crew, and the vast unknown. And then, after weeks at sea, a lookout shouts the magical words, "Land ho, Columbus has done it. He has discovered a new world. He has discovered America." This story is one of the foundational myths of the modern age. It's clean, it's inspiring. It has a clear hero, a daunting challenge, and a triumphant conclusion. It's the story that launched 1,000 school plays and decorated countless bulletin boards. It's the story that gave us a federal holiday. It's presented to us not as a story, but as a fact, as solid and certain as 2 + 2 = 4. Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. But what if that story, the one with the construction paper ships and the heroic captain, isn't the whole story? What if it's not even the most interesting part of the story? What if the very word discovery is the biggest half-truth of them all? Because the tale we all learned in that classroom, the one that's so deeply embedded in our cultural DNA, starts with a fundamental, glaring omission. It forgets to mention the millions of people who were already there, and it conveniently skips over the blonde-haired, axe-wielding mariners who beat Columbus to the punch by 500 years. Today, we are pulling on the thread of one of the most famous facts in history. We're unlearning the simple rhyme to find a much grander, more complicated, and ultimately more truthful epic. We are going to deconstruct the idea that one man could discover a continent. Let's start by giving the traditional story its due. Because to understand why a myth is so powerful, you have to appreciate the narrative it presents. The version of Columbus we meet in our childhood textbooks is a visionary, a man ahead of his time. The story often begins in the royal courts of Europe, where our hero, a brilliant Genoese navigator, is pleading his case. He petitions the King of Portugal, who turns him down. He is mocked, they say, for his belief that the earth is a sphere. He is seen as a fool, a dreamer chasing an impossible fantasy. This is our first dramatic hook, the lone genius against the ignorant establishment. It's a trope we love, but his persistence pays off. He finally convinces the Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, to fund his daring enterprise. They give him 3 small ships, a skeptical crew, and their blessing. On August 3, 1492, the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria set sail from Palos de la Frontera, Spain, heading west into the terrifying, uncharted waters of the Atlantic, what was then known as the Sea of Darkness. The journey, as it's told, is harrowing. Weeks turn into more than 2 months. The sailors, gripped by fear of sea monsters and the very real possibility of starvation, are on the verge of mutiny. They believe they are sailing towards the edge of the world. But Columbus, a master of leadership, calms their fears, steadies their resolve, and urges them onward, his faith and his calculations unshaken. He is the stoic, unwavering captain at the helm of history. And then, on October 12th, it happens. Land is sighted. Columbus and his men go ashore on a small island in what we now call the Bahamas. The myth paints a picture of a lush, tropical paradise, a pristine wilderness, an untouched Eden, and emerging from the trees are the inhabitants, the Indians, so called because Columbus mistakenly believes he has reached the East Indies. They are depicted as simple, childlike people, awestruck by the Europeans, their technology, and their ships. They are passive characters in this drama, props on the stage of discovery. Columbus is the protagonist. He plants the Spanish flag in the soil, claims the land for his patrons, and a new chapter in human history begins. The new world has been open to the old. This moment is presented as the singular, pivotal event that connects two hemispheres and kickstarts the modern era. It's a story of courage, faith, and the triumph of European enlightenment over the unknown. It's simple, it's powerful, and it's almost entirely a carefully constructed fabrication. The first thread we need to pull is perhaps the most obvious one, yet it's the one the traditional story so skillfully avoids. How can you discover a place that is already home to millions of people? When Columbus landed on that Bahamian island, he wasn't stepping into an empty wilderness. He was stepping into a world that was ancient, complex, and thoroughly inhabited. The Americas in 1492 were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million people, a population comparable to that of Europe at the time. These were not scattered, primitive tribes living in some state of nature. They were people organized into a breathtaking diversity of societies and nations. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world, with a population of over 200,000. It was a marvel of engineering, built on an island in a lake, with intricate causeways, canals, and towering pyramids. It was vastly larger, cleaner, and more orderly than any European city of the era, including Columbus's port of departure, Palos. Further south, the Inca Empire stretched for thousands of miles along the Andes Mountains, connected by a complex road system that rivaled that of the Roman Empire. They were masters of agriculture, engineering, and administration. In North America, the Mississippian culture had built the great city of Cahokia, near modern-day St. Louis, a sprawling urban center with enormous earthen mounds that dominated the landscape. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was larger than London. And these are just the big names. From the complex agricultural societies of the eastern woodlands to the intricate coastal communities of the Pacific Northwest, the continents were a vibrant mosaic of cultures, languages, and civilizations that had been developing for millennia. The ancestors of these people had arrived in the Americas at least 15,000 years before Columbus was even born. The prevailing scientific theory is that they migrated from Asia across a land bridge known as Beringia, which connected modern-day Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age when sea levels were much lower. Over thousands of years, they spread south and east, adapting and innovating, populating two entire continents from the Arctic to the tip of Tierra del Fuego. So, to say Columbus discovered this land is a profound act of erasure. It renders invisible 15 millennia of human history, countless generations of people, and the complex civilizations they built. He didn't discover a new world. He stumbled upon a very old one and initiated its collision with another. But even if we set aside the millions of indigenous inhabitants, the claim that Columbus was the first European to reach the Americas still doesn't hold water. For that story, we have to travel north to the icy waters of the North Atlantic and 5 centuries back in time. Our guides for this journey are the Norse, more popularly known as the Vikings. These were the master mariners of their age. From their homelands in Scandinavia, they had used their magnificent longships to raid, trade, and settle across a vast swath of the known world from Russia to North Africa. But their most remarkable achievements were to the west. In the late 800s, they settled Iceland. A century later, around the year 985, an Icelandic chieftain named Eric the Red, exiled for manslaughter, led a fleet of colonists even further west to a massive icy island he shrewdly named Greenland to attract settlers. It was from this Greenland colony that the next and most crucial leap was made. The story is told in 2 medieval Icelandic texts, the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These sagas tell of Eric the Red's own son, a man named Leif Erikson. Around the year 1000, Leif heard tales from another sailor who had been blown off course and sighted a new land to the west of Greenland. Intrigued, Leif bought the man's ship, gathered a crew of about 35 men, and set out to find it. According to the sagas, they first landed on a barren, rocky place they called Helluland, or Land of Flat Stones, which historians believe was likely Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic. They continued south and came to a forested land they named Markland, or Forest Land, probably the coast of Labrador. Finally, they sailed further south still and found a place that was temperate and inviting. They found meadows, a river teeming with salmon larger than any they had ever seen, and most notably, wild grapes growing in abundance. Because of this, Leif Erikson named this new territory Vinland, the land of wine. They built a small settlement, a collection of longhouses and workshops, and spent the winter there before sailing back to Greenland with a cargo of timber and grapes, resources that were incredibly scarce in their homeland. The story didn't end with Leif. The sagas describe several subsequent voyages to Vinland over the next decade, some for exploration, some for trade, and some for attempts at permanent colonization. These expeditions, however, were not entirely peaceful. They describe the first encounters between Europeans and indigenous Americans, whom the Norse called Skraelings. These encounters were often violent and fraught with mistrust, and the small Norse presence, numbering only in the dozens or low hundreds, was ultimately unable to sustain itself so far from home in the face of resistance from a much larger native population. The Norse eventually abandoned their Vinland settlement. For centuries, this was just a story, a tale from old manuscripts dismissed by many historians as heroic folklore, a Viking myth. There was no hard proof, but that all changed in 1960. A Norwegian explorer and writer named Helge Ingstad, along with his archaeologist wife, Anne Stein Ingstad, were determined to find the physical location of Vinland. Guided by the geographical descriptions in the sagas, they meticulously searched the coastline of eastern Canada. At a place called L'Anse aux Meadows, on the northernmost tip of the island of Newfoundland, they found it. They uncovered the buried remains of a small settlement, but it wasn't an indigenous site. The archaeological excavations revealed the foundations of 8 turf-walled buildings, including 3 large longhouses, a forge, and a carpenter's workshop. The style was unmistakably Norse. Inside the forge, they found a stone anvil and hundreds of pieces of iron slag and charcoal. Evidence of iron smelting, a technology unknown to the native peoples of North America at the time. They found a bronze cloak fastening pin, a bone needle, and a spindle whorl used for spinning yarn, all classic Viking artifacts. It was, without a doubt, the Vinland settlement from the sagas. Later, radiocarbon dating of the site confirmed that it was occupied right around the year 1000, nearly 500 years before Columbus set sail. L'Anse aux Meadows is the first and only authenticated Norse site in North America, and it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is the physical, undeniable proof that Europeans not only reached the Americas long before Columbus, but they built homes, worked metal, and lived there, at least for a time. Leif Erikson was the first European to walk on American soil. So why don't we celebrate Leif Erikson Day with the same fervor as Columbus Day? Why are his voyages a historical footnote, while Columbus's journey is treated as the dawn of a new age? The answer brings us to the real story, the nuanced truth that lies beyond the myth of discovery. The real story isn't about who was first. It's about who initiated lasting change. Leif Erikson's voyage was a monumental achievement of navigation, a dead end in terms of history. The Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows was abandoned. The knowledge of its existence faded into saga and legend. It had no lasting impact on the peoples of the Americas, and it had no lasting impact on the societies of Europe. The connection was made, but it was severed. The two worlds touched briefly, then fell apart again, remaining in virtual isolation for another 5 centuries. Columbus's voyage in 1492 was different. It wasn't a discovery, but it was a turning point. It was the beginning of continuous, sustained, and permanent contact between the eastern and western hemispheres. This contact set in motion a chain of events that irrevocably transformed the entire planet. This is what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the vast transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technology, diseases, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World. From the Americas, Europe received potatoes, tomatoes, maize or corn, tobacco, cacao, and chili peppers. It's hard to imagine Italian cuisine without the tomato or Irish history without the potato, but both were American crops that revolutionized European agriculture and diets, leading to a population boom. In return, Europe brought wheat, sugar, coffee, and rice to the Americas. They also brought horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep, animals that completely reshaped the ecology and economies of the New World. The horse, in particular, transformed the cultures of the Plains Indians. But the Columbian Exchange had a devastatingly dark side. The Europeans also brought diseases to which the indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and typhus swept across the continents in waves of catastrophic epidemics. These plagues were the single greatest demographic disaster in human history. They wiped out an estimated 90% of the indigenous population in just over a century. This great dying depopulated vast regions, destabilized empires, and made European conquest vastly easier. It was an unintentional but horrifically effective biological weapon. Columbus's voyages didn't just initiate an ecological exchange, they initiated an era of brutal colonization, exploitation, and the transatlantic slave trade. Columbus himself was not the noble hero of the school books. His own journals and the accounts of his contemporaries reveal him as a man driven by a hunger for gold and status. In his governance of the Caribbean islands, he oversaw a regime of enslavement, torture, and mass murder of the native Taino people. His actions were so cruel that even the Spanish crown eventually had him arrested and stripped of his governorship. He was not a discoverer of a new world, but the first in a long line of European conquerors. So why did the myth of Columbus the Discoverer become so powerful, especially in the United States? The story took hold in the late 18th and 19th centuries, when the young nation, having just won its independence from Great Britain, was searching for a national identity and a founding story that wasn't British. Columbus, as an Italian sailing for Spain, was a perfect non-British hero. He could be mythologized as the first American, the man whose daring and vision laid the groundwork for the nation's own destiny. Writers like Washington Irving penned hagiographic biographies that transformed the historical Columbus into the legendary figure we know today, even inventing the fiction that he proved the world was round to a skeptical, flat-earthing public. In reality, any educated person in 1492, and indeed for centuries prior, knew the earth was a sphere. Columbus wasn't arguing about the shape of the earth. He was arguing about its size. He drastically underestimated its circumference, which is why he thought he could reach Asia by sailing west. The myth served a purpose. It provided a clean, heroic origin story for European settlement in the Americas, one that celebrated individualism and discovery while conveniently ignoring the violence of conquest and the existence of the civilizations that were displaced and destroyed. It's a much simpler, more comfortable story to tell. So we are left with this journey. We started in a school classroom with a simple rhyme about a man who sailed the ocean blue. We learned a story of a singular hero discovering an empty continent. But by pulling on that one thread, the word discover, the whole tapestry unraveled. We found a continent teeming with ancient civilizations, a place that had been home to millions for 15,000 years. We found the ghosts of Viking longships on the shores of Newfoundland, proof that the first European footsteps landed 5 centuries before Columbus. And we found that Christopher Columbus himself was not the hero of a fairy tale, but a complex and brutal historical figure whose true legacy was not one of discovery, but of initiating a catastrophic and transformative encounter that forever linked 2 worlds, for better and for worse. The half-truth is that Columbus's voyage changed the world. The whole truth is that it did so by setting in motion the conquest of one world by another. Correcting this myth isn't about erasing a historical figure. It's about adding the context that was stripped away. It's about making the story bigger, more accurate, and more honest. It's about recognizing that history is not a collection of simple tales with clear heroes and villains, but a messy, complicated, and often painful story told from many perspectives. The story of the Americas didn't begin in 1492. That date is not a beginning, but a violent interruption of a story that was already ancient. Now you know the real story. What other half-truths are still out there? If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment, and join us next time. Until then, stay curious.